Here in St. Louis, St. Louis is becoming known outside of the region as a nice hub for entrepreneurs and startups, lots of different incubators. What would be your thought on the role of entrepreneurs in helping to drive the pace of change that needs to be accelerated?
Well, clearly there's a lot of change ahead, and a lot of entrepreneurs are going to help make it happen. And I think for every place, every metropolitan area like St. Louis, at this scale, you also need planning and thinking ahead and helping to orient the thinking. I'll give you just a quick example. In New York City, we're trying to grapple with how do we decarbonize New York City. And I am co-chair of a committee for the mayor looking at this. The city had never systematically considered this question before because it wasn't the kind of question that anyone thought about until very, very recently. We just undertook a study. You can find it online. It's called the Deep Decarbonization for the Northeast of the U.S. And the point is that thinking in a strategic way about what the U.S. Northeast could do, we showed quantitatively how many important links there are between Canada and the Northeast of the U.S. in solving this decarbonization problem. I would say for you here, do the same thing. What are the plans for this region? What are the plans for Missouri? What are the plans for the Midwest? Wind power is, of course, a phenomenal potential all through this region. You need new high voltage direct current lines to bring it economically to major population centers. This is what your congressional delegation should be working on. This is what the universities, I think, should be working on together with the business community. In other words, at this moment, we need entrepreneurship for targeted problem solving. We have real problems. We need real solutions. They're not going to come out of Washington aside from the reasons that I mentioned before, because the knowledge base is here, because the universities are here, because if you don't care about the solution here, it's not going to come from outside. So this is where I would really try to bring the business community, the universities, and the politicians together and say, let's cut all the nonsense out. Maybe it's going to take 5 years or 10 years to get our national politics around this, but this country is moving to a zero carbon energy system. Where do we fit into that? And what is our strategy? And I think that would make a very big difference.
Thanks. PJ, one quick question for you too, and then we'll open it up. You talk about, here in the state of Missouri, we've got about 4,000 solar and wind jobs, but we've still got about 2,000 people here who work in coal. And we all want this transition, but the LADC has been such sort of a cornerstone here of this conversation. Is there a responsibility? You mentioned companies like here in St. Louis, IKEA, but you've got Bunge and you've got Monsanto and you've got AT&T, you've got Boeing that are all accelerating the use to renewable energy. Is there a social responsibility on their part to help provide the type and encourage the type of retraining? So we've got solar companies here in St. Louis that are retraining coal miners for these jobs, but is there a greater responsibility for these companies that are really moving the transition to renewable energy to help spur some dialogue, political discourse on retraining coal miners?
That's a great question. I think in a lot of ways we all have a responsibility as citizens to think about how we as a society respond in these cases where workers are displaced for any reason, whether it's big shifts in industry like this, like with energy, whether it's automation, other shifts in technology, trade. McKinsey and Company just had a report a few months ago that came out that said by 2030, a third of Americans might need to get new types of skills and maybe even shift their work, their career path because of job automation. And so they called for a kind of Marshall Plan scale response that involves trying new models for helping workers gain new skills, helping them make the adjustments when they need to, providing income support in some cases. So I think we all have a responsibility to be sort of thinking about how we respond to that, supporting politicians, asking politicians about whether they support these kinds of efforts, and really holding their feet to the fire. So, and yes, to the extent that I think the renewable energy companies have a special responsibility in this regard, but I think they also have a special opportunity because it's really in their enlightened self-interest, both from a branding, marketing perspective, clearly, but also because they need great workers and great skills. And so, we're better to turn than those folks. And the good news here is that there are a lot of new jobs, as Jeff mentioned earlier in his talk, a lot of great new jobs that are being created, better quality jobs, higher paying jobs. I think solar is producing 4 times the number of jobs than coal, 5 times the amount of jobs than natural gas. The number of solar jobs jumped up, doubled in a 5-year period between 2010 and 2015. Wind technician is now the fastest growing job description according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Just lots of great things happening here. And think about how exciting it would be if our country really got behind creating the incentives, the policy incentives in that environment to really propel this forward. Lots of great possibilities coming down the pike.
Thanks. Who's got a question? Yeah.
This is working or not? Oh,
It is.
Is there a climate grading system for companies, so whether you're an employee, a future employee, a customer, that you can go and look at what a grade is? Or like on a Morningstar financial report, whether it's an individual stock or it's a mutual fund, of all the data points Morningstar collects, why can't I see on the front page a climate-related, not self-reported, but verifiable grade?
Bravo.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist.
Although I think we're moving in that direction. That's what investors are increasingly looking for, more apples to apples kind of metrics and comparisons. There's a lot of work happening in that regard. And one place to kind of look, if you're interested, is the climate CDP. It used to be known as the Climate Disclosure Project. Now they're just CDP because they also have water disclosure and other things. But that's a good place to start.
But if you're buying tissue and it's Georgia Pacific made, the Koch brothers own it, don't buy it. Seriously. We really need, actually, as consumers, to be a lot more active and a lot more aware. And we need to especially confront those two because they've done more damage than any other two people on the planet probably on this issue because of their control over the Republican Party.
My name's David Crossley. I'm from St. Louis University. I teach renewable energy. And I'd like to suggest maybe that from everything I know, renewable in terms of solar and wind will not be able to replace fossil fuels at the same level at which we're using those resources today. It's simply not possible. And the reason is that the energy returned over the energy invested in such technologies is too marginal to give us the lifestyle that we have today. Right now we have world growth at about 2%. That's projected to go to the mid-century. 2% growth is a 35-year doubling time. So we're expected to be able to generate twice as much energy, twice as much emissions by 2050 as we are doing today. Now that's simply not going to be sustainable in any way. And if we're going to have zero growth economy, what does that mean for companies that are trying to survive? So there's a number of questions here which I think are rather serious in terms of trying to simply say we switch from coal, gas and oil to renewables. There's a huge amount to be done, and I don't even think a lot of experts believe that's possible.
I'm going to cite a paper.
While Jeff is grabbing the paper, I'll just say that, I think oftentimes when we look at solutions here and we talk about the options, it's important to know that it's often a question of and as opposed to either or. And I think if you look at a lot of things like natural gas, for example, versus coal for electricity, people describe that as a bridge fuel. There's a lot of bridging technologies that we imagine. There's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that need to come together. It's not a matter of transitioning overnight and causing massive disruptions. It's not a matter of stopping all growth necessarily. It's a combination of things, and fortunately, there's a lot of really thoughtful minds, I think, that are at
Keep
work.
talking.
Oh, you're still looking for your paper? The one thing I did want to make sure, while I have the floor, to give a shout out to the woman who runs the St. Louis, she's the sustainability director for St. Louis here. Knowing that I was coming here, I wanted to get in touch with her to find out what she's doing and what the city's doing and how some of you might be able to support it. And it turns out that there's a really terrific climate plan that's in place for St. Louis. But it's, as you can imagine, it's under-resourced. This woman's name is Catherine Werner. She's in the mayor's office. And for those of you that are in business or that want to be somehow supportive, they need resources, in-kind resources, support in a lot of different ways. And for companies, there's lots of sponsorship opportunities. So that's one way to sort of get involved at the local level.
Yeah, basically, I don't agree with your conclusion. And there are a number of scenarios now which are being developed. I was also just in China last week reviewing a number of them that show very substantial penetration of the grid by renewables, almost at no incremental cost. And I'll just read you one example. Our results show that when using future anticipated costs for wind and solar, carbon dioxide emissions from the U.S. electricity sector can be reduced by up to 80% relative to 1990 levels without an increase in the levelized cost of electricity. This by McDonald, Clack, and others in Nature Climate Change 2016. Shaner, Davis, Lewis, and Caldera also made the conclusion 80% of total U.S. electricity demand. Our study showed the same thing for the U.S. Northeast. NREL, its renewable electricity's future studies show the same. What's true is these are 80% and they show no increase of cost. And the last 20% gets tougher and tougher. But the point is, there are technological pathways, but we can go most of the way with almost no change of cost at all. And that's what we need to be doing. Of course, we need to plan for that. We need to decide how we're going to do it. We need to build new transmission systems in the US and in other countries. But there's plenty of renewable energy in this world and vastly improving technologies. And even if you take the outer limit, that it's another 1% of GDP, which is a kind of traditional estimate of IPCC and others, that output, you need 1 percentage point of output incremental to move to decarbonization. That's to save the world. So I just don't regard that as that we have a fundamental barrier. The other point I would make is there's, as you know, I'm sure because it's very well documented, there are so many ways for energy efficiency. So the idea that we need to double the energy output to keep the same level of services is also not correct. So the three main pillars that are needed are energy efficiency, for sure, and that is in industrial processes, in building, in transport, in many sectors already identified. Second is zero carbon electricity. And the third is electrification of vehicles, of heating, of industrial processes using that clean grid. That's a pathway.
Okay, we've got time for one more quick question.
Hello, my name's Nancy Tuckman. I'm at Loyola University, Chicago. And a question I had is, I guess directed to you, Jeffrey, because you keep talking about how we need a plan, and I totally agree with that. But I'm wondering if Gina McCarthy's Clean Power Plan is kind of a template that can be used by states, that it has been picked up by some states, and just how much do you think that that template has in terms of really giving legs to building plans that could be implemented in the foreseeable future?
I think each region needs to understand its renewable energy options, whether to be importing the renewable energy or to be developing it in situ nearby. And so for the Midwest, wind power, or Canadian hydro, for the US Southwest, solar energy, for other areas, other options. Geothermal, offshore wind. We have tremendous amount of offshore wind, of course, in the eastern seaboard of the United States. Every city has to plan for an all-electric future. This is another point, which is that the transport systems are going to be overhauled pretty fundamentally in all our cities. Car ownership is going to go down significantly. We're going to have car sharing, a lot more public transport, a lot more pleasant cities than the 20th century car-built cities as well. So I think that there are some broad national basic ideas. There needs to be some strategic design of the national grid, because key for this is bringing renewables from one place to another and expanding the reach, because renewables are intermittent. So where it's windy in one place and not in another, you can trade in smart real time now, or you can balance wind, sunshine. And the Chinese idea is to do this in a global grid, because electrons really move fast. So it's actually possible to do it at a scale of thousands of kilometers with very, very low energy loss. But each city, each metropolitan area should be asking this question: what are we doing? And mention to the congressmen and senators that the game is up. Like in The Wizard of Oz, the curtain has already been pulled back. We already know who's speaking into the microphone. We're done with that period. Now we're into the period of actually planning our way out of the mess, not listening to some voice telling us not to worry. But get the universities, the business community, the community associations to be meeting on what is our solution in Chicago or in St. Louis or in New York City. Then the pieces will come together.
And that concludes our panel. Thank you so much.
Good to see you, Tim.